So hello, welcome back to What the Dickens. We're getting so close to the end now. This is the second last day of What the Dickens, and today I'm going to be talking about my second favourite Dickens novel, my second favourite book of all time in fact, which is Dombey and Son. Chapter 1. Dombey and Son. Dombey lay sat in the corner of the darkened room in the great armchair by the bedside, and Son lay tucked up warm in a little basket bedstead, carefully disposed on a low settee immediately in front of the fire and close to it, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it were essential to toast him brown while he was very new. Dombey was about 48 years of age, Son about 48 minutes. Dombey was rather bold, rather red, and though a handsome, well-made man, too stern and pompous in appearance to be prepossessing. Son was very bold and very red, and though of course an undeniably fine infant, somewhat crushed and spotty in his general effect as yet. I am reading from one of my other first editions. This is my first edition of Dombey and Son from 1848. I got this for my 21st birthday from my grandparents, and it is one of my treasured possessions. It is absolutely beautiful. As you can see, it is also full of the original illustrations, which I adore. Now, Dombey and Son. I love this book so much. I first read Dombey and Son when I was at school, and I really liked it, but I think my love of it kind of grew quite a lot over time. I reread it or listened to it on audiobook when I was about 18, I think maybe a year or two after I'd read it, and then I also studied it in my dissertation. I think it's a fascinating, brilliant book. It was right kind of in the middle of Dickens's career, and for me it's when a lot of things in Dickens's career, a lot of his kind of presentation of various different characters, his presentation of women and his kind of interests, what themes are really at the heart of his books, really all changed for me around Dombey and Son. I think it is kind of a fascinating centre point to his work, and I think it is brilliant. So, what is Dombey and Son about? There is a man called Mr. Dombey. Now, Mr. Dombey has a company named Dombey and Son, and the real wish, the real aim of Dombey's life is to make his company good and to pass it on to his son. All his pride is bound up in the company and this idea of this son that will take over the company from him. At the beginning of the book, he has a son, and shortly after the birth of his son, his wife dies. He also has at this point a daughter who is about 6 or 7 at this time, called Florence, but Mr. Dombey has no interest whatsoever in his daughter. His daughter is nothing to him because she is a girl, and girls are not for Dombey and Son. Dombey and Son do not care for girls. No, of course not, because all Mr. Dombey cares about is someone to take over his business. He wants a son. Daughters are nothing to him. And after the death of Florence's mother in childbirth with Florence's brother, Florence is very much neglected. It's very hard for me to explain what Dombey and Son is about, because quite early on in Dombey and Son, about a quarter of the way through, something happens that affects the rest of the novel, and I can't really explain what Dombey and Son is about without telling you about that, and I'm not going to tell you about that, so I'm just going to try and explain in the best way that I can. A lot of Dombey and Son is concerned with the family dynamics of the Dombey family, with Mr. Dombey's complete neglect and disregard of his daughter and his idolisation of his son. His son Paul and Florence actually have a very nice relationship, and they really get on. Paul really worships Florence and loves his elder sister so dearly. The early part of the book does involve them growing up. In fact, the whole of Dombey and Son follows Florence over quite a lot of her life. She's not a child for the majority of the novel. She is more like 18, I believe, by the end of the novel. Things change quite a lot over time. Now, as well as the Dombey family being very important, there is also another young man of significance called Walter. Walter actually works in a very junior position within Dombey and Son. He lives with his uncle who makes naval sea instruments, but that kind of business isn't going really well for him, and so the fact that Walter does work for Dombey and Son, even if in a really kind of lower position, that is a really big important thing for their family. But Walter and Florence are from very different classes, and even though they kind of get on and have this affection for each other, it can't really go anywhere because of the social position that Florence occupies and her father's utter pride in every sense of the word. As always with Dickens, Dombey and Son has a really wide cast of characters, and there are a lot of other very important people. Another very important character is Mr. Dombey's kind of right-hand man called Mr. James Carker, alternatively known as Mr. Carker the manager, because there is also a Mr. Carker the junior who is Mr. John Carker, and he is the brother of Mr. James Carker. They don't have a very good relationship, and their kind of dynamic and their relationship with their sister Harriet is quite important to the book as well. The other central character in Dombey and Son is a woman called Edith Granger, who becomes Mr. Dombey's second wife, and she is a fascinating character, but I will talk about her in a minute. Dombey and Son is a book about money, it is a book about family, it is a book about gender, and it is a book about what Victorian society perceives as the right way for men to behave and what might be wrong with that. It is also a book about father-daughter relationships, about family dynamics, and about the kind of cold, repressive nature of Victorian masculinity in a fascinating way. You can tell why this is right up my alley, can't you? It's also a book about reputation and class, about loss, about love and grief. There are some brilliant, beautiful bits in it. It's just so good. So, things I love about Dombey and Son. One of the things I really love about it, as will not surprise you, is the kind of gender dynamics going on within Dombey and Son. The book is kind of set up in a way as a dichotomy, as a battle between Mr. Dombey's Victorian masculinity, his repressed nature, his refusal to feel any emotions. He is all about rationality and logic. He is cold and harsh and refuses to feel love. This is set up against Florence, who is the embodiment of this kind of Victorian female idea of emotion and kindness and love and affection and caring for other people in the face of everything. And of course that kind of binary is a very Victorian creation, this idea of men as rational and women as emotional. But what is interesting in Dombey and Son is that Florence wins. Dickens completely supports Florence, and what you can read Dombey and Son as is a complete criticism of the Victorian ideals of masculinity and just how damaging they can be for people. I think that is fascinating for a book to have been written in 1848. I think that is wonderful. It's great. Another thing, I really think the plot of Dombey and Son is very good. As I said, there are some incredibly moving bits in this. It contains one of the most moving scenes in all of Dickens. I was out running, going jogging, listening to the audiobook of Dombey and Son, and when this scene happened, I was just there, like in floods of tears, running along. It was just, oh, it's such a powerful book. It is one of the most emotionally engaging books that Dickens has written. You really sympathise with the situations of the characters, and it is so sad. The childhood Florence has and the way her father behaves towards her is just so tragic, and it was the lot of a lot of Victorian girls, because girls were not valued in the same way as boys were by Victorian society. That is a fascinating thing that Dickens explores so well in Dombey and Son. The character of Edith is brilliant. She is one of my favourite Dickensian characters. I think she is the most interesting woman in all of Dickens. I think I'm going to go so far as to say that. Now, the night before Edith's wedding day, Edith has a conversation with her mother in which Edith basically completely tears apart the Victorian institution of marriage, points out how hypocritical and awful it is, how women in the Victorian marriage market are effectively being sold because they have no other option in life, they have nothing else they can do, so they are forced to marry and basically become slaves to their husbands. Like, that speech is just incredible, and the conversations she has with her mother before her marriage and then how she behaves during her marriage is just absolutely fascinating. Her character is brilliant, and I think one of the most interesting things Dickens does in all his novels with the whole idea of gender. And one of the critics I read when I was doing my dissertation points out that in Edith Dombey you see the emergence of a kind of feminist Dickens. Just briefly, not forever, you know, Dickens' presentation of women is often problematic, but in Dombey and Son, it is fascinating and it is brilliant and it is proto-feminist, because some of the things that Edith is saying are just fascinating and complicated. And as I said, the book is kind of set up as a dichotomy between Florence's femininity and Mr. Dombey's masculinity, but Edith occupies a kind of different femininity, a different presentation of what a woman can be. And what it feels like to me when I read Dombey and Son is that Dickens set out trying to idealise Florence, but actually the figure that really stands out in Dombey and Son, the really powerful figure, is Edith. And Edith is such a brilliant, fascinating character. I just think she is incredible, and that is the reason why Dombey and Son is my second favourite Dickens novel, not Little Dorrit. It is because of Edith. What a character, what a character. More things I love about Dombey and Son. I also love the relationships between the Carker family. Mr. Carker the Jr. and his sister Harriet have a really lovely, well-developed relationship. I feel like brother-sister relationships in early Dickens, such as Kate and Nicholas Nickleby, are not that thoroughly developed, whereas for John and Harriet, you really do feel their friendship and their relationship and the bond they have with each other. I also really love James Carker. I think he is a fascinating character. One of the best in Dickens for being really sinister, but also really charming. And you spend the whole book trying to work out if he is a villain or if he is good, and you just can't quite tell, because he's quite creepy, but then he's also, at times you feel like maybe he's doing the right thing, and you just can't quite work him out. He is a fascinating, creepy, unsettling, but also kind of charming character, and I think he is one of the most complicated in Dickens. He's just a fascinating character. I also think, sorry, we are back on gender again, in Dombey and Son, Dickens has a really interesting way of dealing with ideas of like the fallen woman. It's kind of building on ideas that are brought up in Oliver Twist, but dealing with them in a much more complicated, complete way. I think the themes of money and business and what the Victorian world is built on is very complicated as well, and really interestingly done. I mentioned last week that hard Times is a book that is all about kind of fact versus imagination, and in a way Dombey and Son is too, but in a more complicated and subtle way. In Mr. Dombey and Florence we have logic versus love, and that is really a kind of important central aspect to Dombey and Son, but I think it fits much more nicely in with the plot, and you're still really emotionally engaged with the characters. It doesn't feel as philosophical as Hard Times, even though it is being so. I think it's much more subtly and kind of better done. And I love that Dombey and Son has some moving, tender, beautiful bits, but also some really funny, entertaining characters. I adore Captain Cuttle, I adore Mr. Toots. Mr. Toots is just wonderful. I love Susan, Florence's maid, who I just want to like hug. She's just such a kind of quirky, unusual, but really brilliant character, and there is a moment in the book where she stands up to Mr. Dombey on behalf of Florence, and the things she says are just wonderful. She's just such a kind of intelligent, feisty character. I think the writing in Dombey and Son is done really well. I mean, from the bit that I read at the beginning, I was going to stop after the first paragraph, and then I wanted to carry on reading it aloud, because I think Dombey and Son, at this point halfway through his career, is where Dickens's language becomes a lot more polished and complicated. You may have noticed that in the first week, when I was often talking about Dickens's earlier novels, the introductions, the opening sentences of Dickens's books tend to be a bit more kind of complicated and rambly, and I think that kind of changes over the course of his novels, and his openings become stronger and often start with much shorter sentences. And Dombey and Son, I think, has a really strong opening, and just all of the writing throughout, there are a lot of really interesting, beautiful passages. And the way it deals with the kind of family themes and the theme of loneliness, the way it deals with the like harshness and struggles that Florence has is just beautiful and wonderful, and I just love it. I love it so much. There is so much to love about Dombey and Son. I suppose I should say some things I like less. There aren't many. I mean, I don't think Walter is the most interesting hero, but I kind of like that the focus of Dombey and Son isn't about Florence's relationship with Walter, it's about her relationship with her father and her brother. It's about kind of her family, not like her love life. I like that. I think that's quite nicely done. Florence has been criticised for being more similar to Dickens's early heroines who don't have much personality, but I don't actually think that's true. Yes, Florence Dombey is not quite as complex as Amy Dorrit or as the women in Our Mutual Friend, and yes, Florence is still presented with this kind of angelic glow that is a bit patronising, but at the same time, even if her personality is not fully developed, her emotions are, and you always feel with her, especially the kind of loneliness she feels and the rejection she always feels from her father, and how she struggles with that kind of exclusion from her family. I think that is done brilliantly. So even if you don't always get like a full sense of Florence's personality, you get such a sense of what she's feeling that you kind of do anyway. So yeah, there's not much I don't like about Dombey and Son. All in all, I just adore Dombey and Son. I think it is a beautiful, beautiful, fascinating book. I think it's really, really interesting in terms of Dickens's presentation of gender, but also just in terms of his plot structures and kind of engagement, because as I said, I think it's one of the most beautiful and moving of all Dickens's books, and I love the mix of comedy and seriousness that it has in it. It's both dark, but also it has some really funny characters and some really moving, tender bits, and I do just love it so much. I highly recommend it. I think it's a perfectly good place to start with Dickens if you want to. Just in general, please read it. Please everybody read Dombey and Son, because it is definitely one of Dickens's less well-known novels, and I don't know why, because it is so good. It is so good. Okay, time to calm down. Tomorrow I'll be back with even more excitement for my favourite Dickens novel. You all know what it is. I talk about this book all the time, but I'm so excited. Oh, I'm so excited. Anyway. Oh no, I can't say that because of spoilers, but I love it.